welcome. This is Sean Sutter of Metal King Studio, and I have recorded the process of creating a crab warrior. This is the screen capture from the Procreate app as I was sketching it out. I had a lot of questions about what a crab would look like. I've wanted to make a crab character for a while, and these sketches really helped me work out exactly how humanoid it'd be, how crabby it'd be, and some of the funny questions that you might have about a fantasy crab. Now, jumping into ZBrush, I loaded in a past Relicblade sculpt. Then I threw down a base so I knew how big a 25mm base needs to be in the space. And then started using the spherical cylinder as the core shape I'm going to use to build out and block in all of the forms for the sculpture. I use various shapes from time to time. I use spheres or cubes or whatever, but I've really been into this sphere shape lately. It's sort of like the ubiquitous sausage wormy dealy that you would use in traditional sculpture. And so I find it to be a very nice general shape to work from. So I'm thinking about the proportion, and I'm thinking about what subtools I want, upper arm, lower arm, elbow, shoulder, for the armor as I work through blocking in all of the shapes. The next step, I go straight from blocking in to creating some of the more specific shapes. So here on the body, I'm refining it into the crab forms, knowing that I want the back to be a big, lumpy, crab shape. I sort of based this, the crabness of this guy on the Alaskan king crab. It's got really long limbs, relatively small claws. That was one thing I wanted out of the crab warrior, is rather than being more crab, where he'd be like a walking tank with giant claws, I want him to be more warrior, so I thought the long gangly limbs with little pincers and stuff would be kind of a fun take. And then also actually equipping him with knightly armor, so that he's not just relying on his natural spiky armor, but he still doesn't want to get hit by an axe, I guess. So I'm refining the shapes, doing more of the specific stuff, like shaping a shoulder pad into kind of the shoulder pad shape I had in mind, getting the elbows with the really pointy end as a cap for the elbow shape of the armor. I guess I don't know what elbow armor is called, which, you can Google it and put it in the comments. And then, working on the skirt a little bit, working on the different parts of the armor, trying to make sure that it's sort of getting the very general shapes, and not worrying about specifics, but thinking more about proportion and blocking in, and then getting a little bit more specific than just cubes everywhere, but really trying to refine it into just the most basic little action figure guy. One thing that's fun you could see in that is using the move tool on the shapes before they get dynameshed. You can kind of manipulate them in using their basic geometry in ways that create flowing shapes that actually work really well for the general like crabby exoskeleton that I'm working for. Even though this video is going to run kind of long, it's still so rushed because going through all the steps of sculpting a miniature, there's a lot to say. And I'll try to say meaningful things, but I also am going to be, creating this video content not necessarily as like a tutorial or even really a super entertaining craft video, but more just a little behind the scenes look at Metal King Studio, Sean Sutter's brain as he's working through ZBrush and creating new characters for Relicblade. So I think we're getting close to getting the basic shapes in place, which is very cool. I added a gorget to the armor, which is funny, the idea of protecting the neck of a guy who doesn't have a neck. And then here I loaded in another character from that same faction into ZBrush, one of the other sculpts, so I could look at the scale comparison and proportion and try and figure out like how this miniature will fit into the range of the other characters in his faction. Then I just duplicated and mirrored the position of the various subtools that make up his arms and legs. And now with the whole body in place, I can think more about pose and think about proportion a little bit more accurately, as I'm seeing him more as a, you know, a guy with a body rather than just a torso and one arm and one leg. The sculpting process for me is still somewhat exploratory because I work from my own concept art, and my own concept art isn't necessarily as fleshed out as it would be if I were, you know, trying to communicate with a sculptor. I'm just communicating what exists in my imagination and to myself. So my sketches are very, very light on information, and that when you run into areas that are not defined in the concept art, you do have to do some problem solving. And then also, you know, poses that make an interesting shape in 2D hopefully will make a cool shape in 3D, but also run into some practical issues of like, how does a crab bend that way, or how does armor really shape that way, or will, when it's being 3D printed or when it's being cast more specifically, will the pose be paintable? Will it be fun to paint? Like, I don't want to be covering up cool stuff with his claw in front of him. I want you to be able to paint his armor, you know, I want you to be able to paint his claw. So thinking a lot about the end product of how you'll engage with and enjoy the sculpture while I'm deciding exactly what pose I want to go for. You can see me, I flipped back and forth. I flipped back and forth between the squid and the crab to try and figure out, you know, make sure he's the right height, make sure the pose is going to be okay, and then work from there, slowly working toward getting the pose set up. And I like to pose my miniatures really relatively early in the process. And you can see I haven't really refined any of the details or sculpted any of the like interesting parts before I get the pose locked in. So with the pose sort of figured out, I put a little placeholder there for that he should be holding weapons, and then start to think more about the next step of the process. And the next step is just bringing all of the shapes that I put the very, very general basic stuff in and into more specific shapes, more specific details. And so starting here with this big spiky shoulder pad, I really wanted to capture some of that Alaskan crab, the king crab spikiness in his armor bit. So trying to make it chaotically spiky while also hopefully castable in the future is a challenge, but it's one I knew I would need to deal with going into anything for this faction, because the faction from, it's called the Deep, or the Apostles of the Deep in Relicblade, and these guys tend to be pretty wonky, pretty wacky, and very organic and spiky with hard coral edges, but also lots of natural, soft, organic shapes in them. So this sculpture definitely is very loose and free, where I'm just messing around, adding barnacles here and there, dents and scratches wherever I want. It's a lot different than, you know, having to sculpt something that needs to be perfect or needs to be really well defined as like a human in armor. You know, that would need to be pretty strict. Whereas a mutated crab monster, his claw can have any kind of wackiness that I feel like looks good and tells the story of who this character is. I really like the idea of him having crab claws, but just using them as hands. Like, often I think the default of me imagining a crab warrior is that he would use his claws as a shield or as a pincer weapon. And so when the idea occurred to me that it was just going to be his goofy hands, that really clicked for me. It made me want to make this character for sure, rather than just sort of wait and imagine stuff. So now that I've done more of the general refining of the shapes, I'm getting more into specifics also. So following it, the whole process works from general to specific. And so at this stage, you can see me texturing the crab carapace, and you can see me refining some of the details on the armor, and I'm going through it just like one part at a time, referring to the concept art and then jumping in and scratching out the details using the clay buildup tool with the soft sphere alpha in order to make dents and add like kind of an interesting modulation to the texture. That's not going to be overly detailed for like unpaintable, but it'll be nice. It'll add some like surface texture to the end product when people are painting it. I thought it'd be fun for him to have this big like heavy duty studded belt, give him kind of a heavy metal rock and roll studded look to his armor. I thought would be fun with this crabby guy. Digging into his limbs, I'm just continuing to work from one piece to the next, refining the shape first, and then making sure I cut in the details and cut in and refine things as I go. This kind of like semi-natural coral hard armor has a lot of lumpy texture, and it's a lot of fun for me because it gives me a lot of creative freedom rather than being like a fine polished steel. I've got like a lot more flexibility with barnacles and lumps and scratches and battle damage on his armor. It's very fun. So yeah, I mean, this step is a lot of just rendering of the details, refining, looking at one piece at a time, while also taking the time every once in a while to step back and look at the whole figure. You can see I'm using the transparent setting a lot. It makes it so that when I have a single subtool selected, everything else becomes transparent. Makes it easier to see what you're working on, but it also makes it easier to focus on that piece while also understanding the context of where that piece is going to be. So at this stage, I'm refining extra part of the pauldron that protects his upper arm. And using the transparent setting, I'm able to see it as it's on his arm, how it sets on his arm, how it sets into the pauldron, while also being able to refine the shape specifically and really focus on it. The feet on this guy are like kind of a funny problem to try and imagine. Like what the heck does a crab mutant's feet look like? And I thought it'd be fun to just do a little spike, on the end, like a real crab foot, but then also imagining knight armor, how it's segmented with various things on the sabaton. I think that's what it's called. Foot armor. And, as I'm refining his legs, it also really comes into exactly how crabby and wacky his pose is. And he's in like this impossible crouch, really wide-legged, goofy crouch. And I think that's important to get across just how wacky and crabby he is. Trying to, again, balance between him being like a humanoid mutant while also refining or defining how crabby he is. In the concept art, his two pauldrons are not identical, so I did have to sculpt them separately rather than sculpting one and mirroring it. But I think it worked out, and only on one side does he have that extra piece of his pauldron that protects his upper arm. And then also in a lot of the other deep characters have a medallion hanging there with an eye symbol on it. So some kind of sign of the old gods that they carry on their armor. This whole process, as I'm refining details and pose, I'm always thinking, unfortunately, about mold making and various production issues, and that's something that would need to go into another video if you wanted to learn more about that. But you know, as I'm making every shape, I'm thinking about how it's going to try and fit into a two-part mold and what a pain that's going to be. And it always is a problem. You know, there's always undercuts. Thankfully, the materials I work with the rubber molds are somewhat forgiving, but they do get damaged if I do a bad job, and that ends up, you know, costing my business a bunch of money. So I've got to try and be mindful of those requirements all along. And I find that it's a lot less of a headache to worry about it early rather than have to just struggle and think only about engineering later. I increased the resolution on his body and was able to cut in deeper details. Overall, I keep the resolution relatively low on all of my subtools, just enough to get the level of detail that I'm working on at the moment. And so a lot of these subtools are around resolution 200, but it should be said that depending on how big the piece is, that resolution spread across a larger piece is going to behave differently. So that's one reason why I start with that 25 millimeter base from other sculpts, is it really I'll be able to predict how the material is going to react because the space adopts the same sort of resolution from my past sculptures, and so I don't have to worry as much about it. Here I'm adding some spikes. Looking at some photos, references of the crabs, I noticed that while there were a lot of irregular lumps and everything all over, bumps and whatever, the spikes on his back are mirrored. Now, I'm jumping into making weapons, and I'm using that sphere, a tube again, and then another sphere to make his mace. And this could have gone more smoothly. You know, I could have been more specific about what size, shapes, and things I wanted to work with. But the wonkiness of the sketch and the wonkiness of the overall faction made me want to do things a little bit more sloppy, I guess. Or not sloppy. The word I'm looking for is it's like intuitive, or like a natural workflow where I'm working, rather than making the spikes separate subtools so they're very refined and defined, I am just working on the one subtool so that I'm bringing it out in kind of like a cartoony, soft, spiky action weapon. It's hard to describe exactly what I mean, but it is different than I would do if I was making like a nicely forged weapon out of steel. This is supposed to be a very weird, cartoony action weapon. Now, once I have the overall weapon done, I merged it into a single tool and then posed it into his claw. And exactly how they fit into the claws took a little bit of experimenting, because it's not very natural to hold a weapon in a big long claw. Now, you know, I'm just working with the subtools, from the subtools, and refining with trim dynamic and clay buildup and the clip tool, and sort of also taking advantage of the mirror and weld feature to try and create some symmetry to the weapon. Even though I want it to be wonky, I wanted to be able to refine and keep the shapes somewhat symmetrical. You can see me switching how it aligns along the z-axis, so that when I mirror it, it can mirror either the axe left to right or front to back or whatever to get the axe blade or the mace mirrored exactly as I want. Making weapons can be a lot of fun, and you can go into a ton of detail on these digital sculptures. But I find that, keeping the scope at a 28 millimeter scale is useful. You want to think about the fact that the finished product's going to be very small, and so as I'm adding details and doing the finishing touches on the figure, it matters that it's going to be small. So I'm not going to add like unmanageably small details to the weapons, because that only detracts from the joy of painting it, in my opinion. Now, a lot of this stage is just looking at the whole model, flipping it around side to side, top to bottom, searching through all of the different details of the figure to try and make sure it looks the way I want and see if I missed anything. And funny enough, that's the first time I saved my progress, which you should probably save more often than that. And we're really closing in on the end of this sculpt. I wanted the axe to have more of the mace, rounded mace style, and then decided to add some more wraps to the hilt of the weapon, or the handle of the weapon. I figure he needs a little bit extra grippy stuff so that he can be nimble with his claws while he's wielding a little axe and mace. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the end stage is just looking at what you did and trying to decide if it'll cast, trying to decide if you forgot something, if there's important details that you've missed. And those finishing touches, you can go and do them forever, but I tend to try to remind myself to keep things more simple on my sculptures. I really like to have enjoyable painting experiences where I'm not overwhelming you with too many little decorative details everywhere. I could cover this guy in skulls and then you'd have to paint skulls, but I think the one little thing on his chest plate is cool, but he doesn't need to be covered. Now, as I finish up the sculpting process, I'm going to slow down and talk a little bit about getting it ready to print, because I think that's of some interest. What I do is I merge the whole thing, not excluding the base, but I merge the subtools that I want, dynamesh them again, so that the whole thing is a unified mesh. No subtools anymore, just the one subtool. And then dig in and zoom in and look for places that need to be filled in a little bit, because when you're casting, you don't need these tiny pockets can be a problem and can tear the mold. So I'm looking for places that'll be a problem, like here inside the pincer, between the pincer and the weapon. I'm adding a little bit of shape as filler so that it will cast a little bit better and won't damage the mold as much. it's not a perfect system. I'm not like doing the really fine engineering that you'd need to do if you were going to put this in plastic. But I do, it does benefit me to come in and fill in some of those recessed shapes and empty spots. And so once it's all done, I go to Z plugin and I get out the decimation master and I pre-process the parts. And what that does is it creates some kind of topology of the overall thing, and then I can reduce the overall geometry in a very smooth way. So I was able to take something that was 3 million polygons and make it 300,000, and that refined it, and it's ready to print. Here are some renders of that final export, and we have a new character ready for Relicblade. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that somewhat interesting to see the whole process. And keep an eye out on relicblade.com for when this amazing new crab warrior is going to hit tabletops around the world.